In the mid-17th century, Europe was not at peace. Kings fought kings, nations fractured from within, and religious divisions turned neighbors into enemies. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the Americas were no longer distant lands of opportunity. They had become extensions of European ambition, silent battlefields where power, wealth, and influence were contested without mercy. Between 1642 and 1650, Europe's greatest powers, Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands, were locked in intense rivalry. These conflicts did not remain confined to European soil. They crossed oceans, reshaped colonies, and permanently altered the fate of the Americas. Colonies were no longer experiments or refuges. They were instruments of empire, vital to survival in a rapidly changing world. For more than a century, Spain had ruled much of the Americas with near-total dominance. Vast shipments of gold and silver flowed from Mexico and Peru, fueling Spanish armies and monarchs. Missions stretched across continents, spreading Catholicism alongside imperial control. Yet by the 1640s, the Spanish Empire was weakening. Endless wars in Europe drained its treasury. Inflation caused by New World silver destabilized the economy. Revolts erupted in Portugal and Catalonia, exposing deep internal fractures. Spain still possessed enormous territories, but its grip was loosening, and rival nations watched closely, waiting for their moment. That moment came as England descended into chaos. In 1642, civil war erupted between King Charles I and Parliament. Royalists and parliamentarians clashed across the British Isles, tearing the nation apart. This conflict reached far beyond England's shores. In the American colonies, loyalties divided families, communities, and governments. Some colonies supported the crown, while others sided with Parliament. Trade routes collapsed, governors were replaced, and authority became uncertain. For the first time, English colonies experienced life without strong royal control. They learned to govern themselves, manage their own defenses, and survive independently, planting early seeds of autonomy long before the idea of revolution emerged. France approached the Americas with a different strategy. Rather than focusing on mass settlement, France built power through trade and alliances. In New France, along the St. Lawrence River, French traders formed close relationships with indigenous nations. They learned local languages, married into tribal communities, and exchanged European goods for valuable furs. French influence spread deep into the continent, not through numbers, but through cooperation. By the 1640s, French trade networks extended throughout the interior of North America, challenging both English and Spanish claims, and reshaping the balance of power. The Netherlands, though small in size, stood among the most powerful nations in the world. Dutch merchants dominated global commerce with advanced shipping, strong banks, and efficient ports. In the Americas, Dutch colonies were designed for one purpose: profit. New Netherland, centered around modern-day New York, became a vital trading hub connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Religious tolerance and cultural diversity were encouraged, not for moral reasons, but because they attracted business. However, this success made the Dutch vulnerable. Their wealth drew envy, and rival empires began to target Dutch colonies and trade routes. As European rivalries intensified, colonial life changed forever. Wars fought in Europe now dictated survival in the Americas. Ports were blockaded, merchant ships seized, and settlements attacked. Colonies built forts, organized militias, and prepared for conflict. Indigenous nations were pulled into these struggles, often forced to choose alliances that would determine their future. The Americas became militarized landscapes where diplomacy, trade, and warfare merged into a single struggle for dominance. By 1650, the balance of power had shifted. Spain remained vast but weakened. England emerged from civil war with a transformed political system. France expanded steadily through strategy and alliance. The Dutch remained wealthy but increasingly exposed to attack. No single empire controlled the Americas anymore. Borders blurred, power shifted, and control was constantly contested. Colonization was no longer about discovery or settlement, it was about domination. Between 1642 and 1650, Europe did not simply extend its reach across the Atlantic. It recreated its conflicts, ambitions, and rivalries on American soil. The Americas became a reflection of Europe's struggles, but the consequences were deeper and longer lasting. The foundations of future wars, nations, and revolutions were laid during this era. What began as rivalry would soon become transformation, and the course of history would never be the same. By the mid-17th century, England's presence in the Americas was no longer fragile. What had once been scattered outposts along the Atlantic coast were transforming into permanent settler colonies, rooted in land ownership, family life, and expanding populations. Between 1650 and the end of the century, English colonization accelerated, reshaping North America through settlement, agriculture, and governance. Land was the driving force. English settlers did not come primarily to trade and return home. They came to stay. Forests were cleared, fields planted, and towns constructed with the expectation of permanence. In Virginia and the Chesapeake region, tobacco dominated the economy. Vast plantations spread along rivers, demanding enormous amounts of labor and consuming more land each year. As soil was exhausted, settlers pushed outward, encroaching on indigenous territories and igniting constant conflict. In New England, colonization followed a different pattern. Communities were built around religion, family, and local governance. Towns were tightly organized, centered on churches and meeting houses. Education was emphasized, laws enforced moral discipline, and social order was strictly maintained. Yet despite their religious ideals, New England colonies were no less aggressive in their expansion. Native lands were seized through treaties, coercion, and violence, often justified as divine entitlement. Farther south, the Carolinas emerged as a new frontier of English ambition. Wealthy landowners envisioned a colony driven by plantation, agriculture, and export crops. Rice, indigo, and later cotton transformed the region into a labor-intensive economy. From its earliest days, slavery was central to Carolina's success. African laborers were imported in growing numbers, creating a rigid social hierarchy that placed English landowners at the top and enslaved Africans at the bottom. As English settlements expanded, systems of self-government developed alongside them. Colonial assemblies formed to manage taxes, laws, and local defense. While these institutions still answered to the crown, they allowed settlers to exercise political power in their daily lives. Over time, this autonomy became expected rather than exceptional. Colonists increasingly viewed themselves not as temporary subjects abroad, but as permanent communities with rights and interests of their own. Expansion, however, came at a devastating cost to indigenous nations. As English populations grew, native communities were pushed off ancestral lands through treaties that favored settlers or through outright violence. Warfare became frequent along the frontier. Entire villages were destroyed, crops burned, and survivors displaced. Disease continued to ravage indigenous populations, weakening resistance and accelerating territorial loss. The balance of power shifted steadily toward the settlers. Labor demands reshaped colonial society. At first, English colonies relied heavily on indentured servants' poor. Europeans bound 2 years of labor in exchange for passage across the Atlantic. But as land became scarce and life expectancy increased, this system declined. Planters turned instead to African slavery, which offered permanent, inheritable labor. By the late 17th century, racial slavery was firmly embedded in English colonial law, defining social divisions that would endure for centuries. English expansion also depended on trade networks that tied the colonies to the Atlantic world. Raw materials flowed to England, while manufactured goods returned across the ocean. The colonies became both suppliers and consumers, deeply integrated into England's economic system. Laws were passed to ensure that colonial trade benefited the mother country, reinforcing imperial control, even as colonial populations grew more independent in practice. Religion played a powerful role in shaping colonial identity. While some colonies enforced strict religious conformity, others offered relative tolerance to attract settlers and investment. This diversity created a patchwork of beliefs across English America, united less by faith than by shared economic interests and territorial ambition. Over time, these differences would challenge centralized authority and strengthen local identities. By the end of the 17th century, English colonies stretched from New England to the southern plantations, bound together by trade, culture, and expanding settlement. The land had been transformed, forests cleared, rivers redirected, indigenous societies shattered, and new social orders imposed. English America was no longer an experiment. It was a growing society, confident, aggressive, and increasingly the foundations of future conflict were already in place. Tensions between colonies and the crown, between settlers and native nations, and between freedom and slavery would shape the centuries to come. English expansion had secured its foothold in the Americas, but at a cost that would echo far beyond the colonial era. While English settlers cleared land and built towns, France pursued a very different vision in the Americas. Rather than filling the continent with European farmers, France sought control through movement, trade, and alliance. This strategy allowed a relatively small French population to exert influence over vast territories, shaping North America in ways that would rival much larger empires. French colonization centered on waterways. Rivers became highways, connecting the Atlantic coast to the deep interior. The St. Lawrence River anchored New France, while the Great Lakes and Mississippi River formed a network that stretched thousands of miles. French explorers, traders, and missionaries traveled these routes, establishing trading posts instead of large settlements. Control of trade mattered more than control of land. At the heart of the French strategy was the fur trade. Beaver pelts were in high demand in Europe, and indigenous nations controlled the territories where these animals thrived. Rather than displacing native communities, the French depended on them. Alliances were essential. Trade partnerships developed with groups such as the Huron, Algonquin, and later many nations of the Mississippi Valley. These relationships were built on mutual dependence, diplomacy, and often intermarriage, creating cultural bridges uncommon in other colonial empires. French traders lived among indigenous communities, adopting local customs and learning languages. Catholic missionaries followed, seeking to convert native peoples, while also acting as cultural intermediaries. Missions were not only religious centers but also outposts of French influence. Through these networks, France extended power far beyond the reach of its soldiers or settlers. This alliance-based system brought advantages. French presence spread across enormous distances with minimal conflict compared to English expansion. Indigenous nations gained access to European goods, weapons, and trade opportunities, while France gained loyalty, protection, and economic dominance in the interior. Yet this system also made France vulnerable. Its power depended on maintaining relationships that could shift with changing circumstances. Competition with England intensified as both empires expanded. English settlers pressed westward, threatening French trade routes and alliances. In response, France built forts at strategic locations to protect waterways and assert claims. These forts were not massive population centers, but military and commercial nodes, designed to control movement and trade rather than territory itself. In the south, French ambition took a bold turn. By the late 17th century, France claimed the Mississippi River basin, naming it Louisiana in honor of King Louis XIV. This claim linked Canada to the Gulf of Mexico, forming a vast crescent of French influence that encircled English colonies along the Atlantic coast. Though sparsely populated, Louisiana represented a strategic masterstroke, limiting English expansion and securing France's access to global trade. Life in French America differed sharply from English colonies. Population growth was slow, and settlements remained small. Farming existed but did not dominate the economy. Instead, mobility defined French colonial life. Canoes replaced wagons, and alliances replaced fences. Authority flowed from trade relationships rather than sheer numbers. Despite its strengths, the French strategy had limits. Without large settler populations, France struggled to defend its claims against encroaching rivals. Control depended on loyalty rather than occupation. When alliances weakened or trade declined, French influence faltered. Disease, warfare, and shifting economic priorities all threatened the fragile balance France relied upon. By 1700, France had built one of the largest territorial empires in North America, with remarkably few settlers. Its power lay not in cleared land or growing towns, but in connections between rivers, peoples, and markets. This approach delayed large-scale conflict, but it could not prevent it. The expanding English colonies and the enduring strength of Spain ensured that rivalry was inevitable. The French strategy of trade over settlement reshaped the continent. It preserved indigenous autonomy longer than other colonial systems, while also drawing native nations deeply into European power struggles. France had proven that empire could be built through alliance rather than conquest, but the survival of that empire would soon be tested by war. By the mid-17th century, Spain still possessed the largest empire in the Americas, stretching from the deserts of northern Mexico to the peaks of the Andes and across the Caribbean Sea. On maps, Spanish power appeared unshakable. In reality, the empire was under immense strain. The challenge Spain faced was no longer how to conquer new lands, but how to hold on to the vast territories it already controlled. For more than a century, Spanish rule had relied on the steady flow of silver and gold from the New World. Mines in Mexico and Peru fueled the empire's economy and financed wars across Europe. But by the 1640s, these mines were producing less, while the costs of maintaining the empire continued to rise. Inflation weakened Spain's economy, debt mounted, and royal authorities stretched thin across continents. Spanish control depended heavily on rigid systems of governance and labor. Indigenous populations were forced into encomienda and repartimiento systems, providing labor for mines, farms, and construction. In theory, these systems offered protection and Christian instruction. In practice, they imposed harsh conditions that devastated native communities. Disease, overwork, and displacement caused massive population decline, leaving entire regions depopulated and economically fragile. To maintain authority, Spain relied on religion as much as military power. Catholic missions spread across the Americas, particularly in frontier regions such as California, Texas, and the American Southwest. Missionaries sought to convert indigenous peoples, reshape their cultures, and bind them to Spanish society. Churches, missions, and presidios became tools of control, reinforcing Spain's presence in areas far from major cities. Yet resistance never disappeared. Indigenous revolts erupted periodically, challenging Spanish authority and exposing its weaknesses. In the Andes, native uprisings threatened colonial order. In Mexico and the northern frontiers, resistance took the form of raids, revolts, and flight into remote regions. Spain responded with force, but each rebellion drained resources and revealed the limits of imperial power. Spain also faced growing threats from rival European powers. English, French, and Dutch pirates attacked Spanish shipping routes and coastal cities, targeting the treasure fleets that carried wealth to Europe. The Caribbean became a zone of constant danger, where Spanish dominance was increasingly challenged. Forts were built, defenses strengthened, but no system could fully protect an empire stretched so wide. In North America, Spanish influence was especially fragile. Settlements were sparse, distances vast, and communications slow. Unlike English colonies filled with settlers or French territories bound by trade alliances, Spanish frontier regions relied on military posts and missions to assert control. This approach maintained presence but limited growth, leaving large areas vulnerable to encroachment by rival empires. Internally, Spain struggled with administrative inefficiency and corruption. Colonial officials often acted in their own interests, exploiting labor and resources while weakening trust in imperial authority. Laws issued from Madrid were difficult to enforce across oceans and mountains. Local elites gained power, blurring the line between loyalty and autonomy. By the late 17th century, Spain remained a formidable empire, but it was no longer unrivaled. Its economy lagged behind its competitors. Its military strength was diluted across too many fronts. Its colonial system, once innovative, had become rigid and slow to adapt. Holding the empire required constant effort, yet every year made the task more difficult. Still, Spain endured. Its cities remained cultural and administrative centers. Its religious institutions shaped daily life across the Americas. Its legacy was deeply embedded in language, law, and tradition. But the age of unquestioned Spanish dominance was over. The struggle to hold the empire defined Spain's role in the Americas during this period. While other powers expanded aggressively, Spain fought to preserve what it had already claimed. This defensive posture would shape future conflicts. As rival empires tested Spain's boundaries and the colonial world moved toward a new balance of power. In the 17th century, the Dutch Republic stood at the center of global commerce. Though small in territory, it possessed unmatched maritime power, advanced financial institutions, and a merchant class driven by profit rather than conquest. In the Americas, the Dutch did not seek to build vast settler societies or convert entire populations. Their empire was designed for trade, efficiency, and economic dominance. Dutch colonization was led not by kings but by companies. The Dutch West India Company controlled colonial expansion, trade, and military operations in the Atlantic world. Its goal was clear: generate profit through commerce, privateering, and control of strategic ports. Colonies were investments, and success was measured in revenue rather than population growth. New Netherland became the centerpiece of Dutch influence in North America. Located along the Hudson River, it served as a vital gateway to the interior. The settlement of New Amsterdam functioned as a bustling port, linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Goods flowed in and out, constantly furs, timber, sugar, enslaved Africans, and manufactured products, making the colony a hub of global exchange. To support commerce, the Dutch practiced remarkable tolerance. Religious freedom and cultural diversity were encouraged, not out of idealism, but practicality. Merchants, artisans, and traders from across Europe were welcome, creating a multilingual, multicultural society. This openness allowed New Netherland to grow rapidly as a trading center, even though its population remained relatively small. Beyond North America, Dutch influence spread throughout the Caribbean and South America. In places such as Suriname and the Dutch Caribbean islands, plantation economies flourished. Sugar production became central, relying heavily on enslaved African labor. The Dutch were deeply involved in the Atlantic slave trade, transporting hundreds of thousands of Africans across the ocean to fuel colonial economies. Profit, not settlement, remained the driving force. The Dutch also challenged older empires directly. Privateers targeted Spanish and Portuguese ships, seizing treasure and disrupting trade routes. These attacks weakened rival powers while enriching Dutch investors. Naval strength allowed the Dutch to dominate key waterways, turning the Atlantic into a contested commercial arena. Yet the Dutch model had weaknesses. Because colonies were designed for trade rather than settlement, they lacked strong military defenses and large populations to protect them. Loyalty was fragile, tied to economic success rather than national identity. When trade declined or rivals attacked, Dutch control could collapse quickly. This vulnerability became clear as England emerged as a powerful competitor. English leaders recognized the value of Dutch ports and trade networks. New Netherland, strategically located between English colonies, became a prime target. In 1664, England seized the colony with little resistance, renaming it New York. The loss exposed the limits of a purely commercial empire. Despite territorial losses, Dutch influence did not disappear. Their financial systems, shipping practices, and commercial mindset reshaped the Atlantic world. Amsterdam remained a global financial center, and Dutch merchants continued to operate across imperial boundaries. The Dutch proved that economic power could rival territorial control, even if it could not always defend it. By the late 17th century, the Dutch commercial empire in the Americas had peaked and begun to decline. Stronger, more militarized empires pushed them aside. Yet their legacy endured in trade networks, urban culture, and global finance. The Dutch had transformed colonization into a business, setting a model that others would imitate and expand upon. The rise and fall of Dutch power revealed a fundamental truth of the colonial era. Wealth could build empires, but without people and protection, even the richest colonies could be taken. As European rivalry intensified, commerce alone would no longer be enough to hold the Americas. European colonization did not go uncontested. From the moment foreign ships arrived on American shores, indigenous nations resisted, adapted, and fought to survive. By the mid-17th century, native peoples across the Americas faced unprecedented pressure from expanding empires, yet they were never passive victims. Their resistance shaped colonial borders, delayed imperial ambitions, and forced European powers to negotiate, compromise, and sometimes retreat. Indigenous resistance took many forms. Some nations chose armed conflict, defending their territories against encroaching settlers and soldiers. Others used diplomacy, forging alliances with European powers to gain weapons, protection, or strategic advantage over rival tribes. These alliances were calculated decisions made in a rapidly changing world, where survival often depended on choosing the least dangerous option. In English territories, resistance frequently erupted along the expanding frontier. As settlers pushed inland, native communities were displaced from their lands through treaties that favored colonists or through outright violence. Wars broke out repeatedly, devastating both sides. Villages were destroyed, crops burned, and survivors forced to flee. Despite overwhelming odds, indigenous fighters used knowledge of the land to conduct raids, ambushes, and prolonged resistance that slowed colonial expansion. In French-controlled regions, resistance followed a different pattern. Because French power relied heavily on trade alliances, indigenous nations often held greater leverage. Tribes could shift alliances, restrict access to trade routes, or support rival powers. This balance allowed many native communities to maintain autonomy longer than in English or Spanish territories. However, dependence on European goods and weapons gradually pulled indigenous societies deeper into colonial conflicts. Spanish-controlled regions saw some of the most sustained resistance. Forced labor systems, religious suppression, and land seizures provoked uprisings across the empire. In the Andes, indigenous revolts challenged colonial authority, while in Mexico and the northern frontiers, resistance took the form of raids, revolts, and cultural survival. Even when rebellions were crushed, they forced Spain to invest heavily in military defense, exposing the fragility of its control. Disease remained one of the greatest threats to indigenous survival. European illnesses such as smallpox, measles, and influenza spread rapidly through native populations with no immunity. Entire communities were wiped out within generations. These losses weakened resistance, disrupted social structures, and left vast territories vulnerable to colonization. Yet survivors rebuilt, reorganized, and adapted in the face of catastrophe. Cultural resistance was as important as military action. Indigenous peoples preserved languages, traditions, and spiritual practices, despite intense pressure to assimilate. Some adopted selective elements of European culture, while maintaining core identities. Others retreated to remote regions, creating new communities beyond colonial reach. Adaptation became a form of survival, allowing cultures to endure even as landscapes changed. Trade transformed indigenous societies in complex ways. Access to European goods altered economies, warfare, and social hierarchies. Firearms increased military power, but also intensified conflict. Alcohol, dependency on trade goods, and shifting alliances brought new challenges. Indigenous leaders navigated these changes carefully, balancing opportunity against risk. By the late 17th century, indigenous resistance had reshaped the colonial world. European empires could not expand freely without confronting native power. Frontiers remained unstable, borders contested, and authority incomplete. Indigenous nations remained central actors in the struggle for control of the Americas, influencing outcomes through resistance, negotiation, and survival. Though colonization inflicted devastating losses, indigenous peoples endured. Their resistance delayed conquest, preserved cultures, and forced empires to adapt. The survival of indigenous nations stands as one of the most powerful and enduring stories of the colonial era, testament to resilience in the face of overwhelming change. By the late 17th century, European colonization in the Americas had become inseparable from one of the largest systems of forced labor in human history. The Atlantic world was bound together by ships, markets, and violence, forming a system in which millions of Africans were captured, transported, and enslaved to fuel imperial expansion. Slavery was not a side effect of colonization. It was its foundation. As European demand for profit grew, so did the need for labor. Vast plantations producing sugar, tobacco, rice, and later cotton required workers in numbers far beyond what European settlers or indigenous populations could supply. Indigenous labor systems had collapsed under disease and exploitation, and indentured servitude proved temporary and unreliable. Enslaved Africans became the solution chosen by empire. The Atlantic slave trade connected 3 continents in a brutal cycle. European manufactured goods were shipped to Africa and exchanged for captives. These captives were then forced onto ships bound for the Americas in a journey known as the Middle Passage. The conditions were horrific. Men, women, and children were chained below deck for weeks or months, packed tightly, deprived of air, food, and dignity. Disease spread rapidly, and death was constant. Those who survived arrived traumatized, stripped of identity, and sold as property. Upon arrival in the Americas, enslaved Africans were sent to plantations, mines, and households. In the Caribbean and Brazil, sugar plantations became centers of extreme exploitation, where life expectancy was often measured in years. In English colonies, tobacco and rice plantations expanded rapidly, reshaping entire regions. Labor was relentless, punishment severe, and resistance met with brutal force. Slavery transformed colonial societies. Laws were created to define enslaved Africans as property, denying them legal rights and reducing human lives to economic assets. These laws hardened over time, tying slavery to race and creating rigid hierarchies that placed Europeans at the top and Africans at the bottom. Freedom and enslavement became inherited conditions, passed from one generation to the next. Yet enslaved Africans did not submit quietly. Resistance took many forms. Some fled into forests and mountains, forming maroon communities beyond colonial control. Others sabotaged equipment, slowed labor, preserved African traditions, or revolted openly. Rebellions terrified colonial authorities, leading to harsher laws and increased surveillance. Every act of resistance challenged the system that sought to erase African humanity. The Atlantic system enriched European empires. Profits from slavery funded cities, industries, and wars. Banks, insurance companies, and shipping firms grew wealthy by financing and protecting the trade. Entire economies were built on the suffering of enslaved people, binding Europe's prosperity to African exploitation and American land. Slavery also reshaped culture and identity in the Americas. African languages, religions, music, and traditions survived despite attempts at erasure. Enslaved communities forged new cultures, blending African heritage with the realities of life in the New World. These cultures became enduring foundations of American societies, influencing food, art, religion, and resistance movements. By 1700, slavery was deeply embedded across the Atlantic world. It structured economies, justified racial ideology, and normalized violence on a massive scale. European colonization had created wealth and power, but it had done so by turning human lives into commodities. The Atlantic system revealed the true cost of empire. Behind the grand cities, profitable plantations, and global trade networks lay unimaginable suffering. Slavery was not only an economic engine, but a moral fracture that would haunt the Americas for centuries. Its legacy would shape future conflicts, revolutions, and struggles for freedom long after the colonial era ended. Religion was one of the most powerful tools European empires carried into the Americas. More than a matter of faith, it became a system of control, justification, and transformation. Through conversion, education, and cultural enforcement, European powers sought not only to rule indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans, but to reshape how they understood the world and their place within it. For Spain, religion stood at the center of empire. Catholicism was inseparable from Spanish authority, and conversion was presented as both a sacred mission and a civilizing duty. Across Mexico, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean, missionaries established churches, missions, and religious schools. Indigenous peoples were baptized, taught Christian doctrine, and pressured to abandon traditional beliefs. Conversion was rarely voluntary. It was enforced through law, labor systems, and the destruction of sacred spaces. Missions became instruments of cultural transformation. Indigenous communities were relocated into mission settlements, where daily life was tightly regulated. Work schedules, clothing, language, and worship were all controlled. Native religions were labeled sinful or demonic, and rituals were banned. While missionaries sometimes offered protection from the worst abuses of colonial labor systems, they also dismantled indigenous social structures and identities. France used religion differently, but no less strategically. Catholic missionaries traveled alongside traders into the interior of North America, embedding themselves within indigenous communities. Conversion was pursued through persuasion rather than force, and missionaries often learned native languages and customs. This approach allowed France to strengthen alliances and expand influence. Yet even here, conversion carried cultural consequences. Christian beliefs slowly altered indigenous traditions, and religious dependence reinforced political ties to France. In English colonies, religion varied widely but remained a powerful force. In New England, Puritan settlers believed they were creating a godly society, chosen by divine will. Laws enforced moral behavior, church attendance was mandatory, and dissent was punished. Indigenous peoples were viewed as obstacles to a religious mission justified by scripture. Conversion efforts existed, but displacement and violence often followed when native communities resisted. Other English colonies adopted greater religious tolerance, not out of idealism, but practicality. Diversity attracted settlers and stabilized colonies. Yet even in these regions, Christianity reinforced social hierarchies and colonial authority. Religious language was used to justify slavery, land seizure, and racial inequality, embedding domination within moral frameworks. Religion also shaped the lives of enslaved Africans. Missionaries debated whether enslaved people should be converted, fearing that Christian baptism might challenge the legitimacy of slavery. Over time, conversion became common, but it did not bring freedom. Instead, Christianity was used to promote obedience and submission. Enslaved Africans adapted the religion in their own ways, blending Christian teachings with African spiritual traditions. This fusion created new forms of worship that preserved identity and fostered resistance. Education became another tool of cultural control. Schools taught European languages, values, and histories while erasing indigenous and African knowledge systems. Literacy was tightly controlled, especially among enslaved populations, to prevent rebellion. Cultural dominance depended on shaping how people thought, remembered, and passed knowledge to future generations. Despite intense pressure, cultural control was never complete. Indigenous peoples preserved traditions in secret, adapted rituals, and reinterpreted Christianity through their own worldviews. Enslaved Africans maintained oral histories, music, and spiritual practices that sustained community and hope. Resistance often took quiet forms, embedded in daily life rather than open revolt. By the end of the 17th century, religion had reshaped the Americas as profoundly as warfare or trade. It justified empire, reinforced authority, and transformed cultures. Churches stood where temples once existed. New beliefs coexisted uneasily with old traditions. Faith became both a weapon of colonization and a refuge for the oppressed. Religion's legacy in the Americas is complex and enduring. It brought comfort and meaning to many, while also serving as a tool of domination. Conversion did not erase identity, but it altered it forever. Through belief, empire reached into the deepest parts of human life, shaping societies in ways that would echo long after colonial rule began to fade. By the late 17th century, the Americas had become a landscape shaped by constant conflict. European empires no longer expanded quietly through settlement or trade alone. War had become a permanent condition of colonial life. Borders shifted not through treaties on distant continents, but through violence on frontiers, raids on settlements, and battles fought far from European capitals. Colonial wars were rarely declared formally in the Americas. They erupted suddenly, fueled by rival claims, trade, competition, and territorial expansion. When Europe went to war, its colonies followed. When peace was signed overseas, violence often continued on the ground. Colonial populations lived with uncertainty, knowing that alliances could change overnight and borders could dissolve without warning. English and French rivalry dominated much of North America. As English settlers pushed westward, they collided with French trade networks and forts. Control of rivers, lakes, and portages became strategic priorities. Small skirmishes escalated into larger conflicts, drawing indigenous nations into the struggle. These wars were not only about land, but about access to trade routes, alliances, and future expansion. Indigenous nations played decisive roles in these conflicts. Their knowledge of terrain, mobility, and warfare shaped outcomes. European forces depended on native allies for survival, intelligence, and military strength. At times, indigenous coalitions halted colonial expansion for years. At other times, rivalries between tribes intensified the destruction. War deepened divisions and reshaped native political landscapes. In English colonies, frontier warfare became a defining experience. Settlements were isolated, vulnerable, and poorly defended. Raids were swift and brutal. Families fled, towns burned, and fear spread along the borderlands. Colonists responded by building forts, forming militias, and adopting harsher policies toward indigenous peoples. Warfare hardened attitudes, reducing opportunities for diplomacy and coexistence. Spain faced constant pressure along its borders. In the Caribbean, Spanish ports and treasure fleets were targeted by pirates and privateers, sponsored by rival empires. Coastal cities were attacked repeatedly, forcing Spain to invest heavily in fortifications. In North America, Spanish territories faced encroachment from English and French forces, particularly in Florida, Texas, and the Southwest. Distance and limited population made defense difficult, leaving large areas contested. The Dutch, though diminished as a territorial power, continued to influence conflicts through trade and finance. Their former colonies became battlegrounds for larger empires. Strategic ports and rivers changed hands, reflecting the shifting balance of power. Warfare increasingly favored nations with larger populations and stronger military organization. Colonial wars were often more brutal than those fought in Europe. There were no clear front lines, no formal rules of engagement, and little protection for civilians. Villages were destroyed to deny enemies resources. Crops were burned, livestock killed, and entire regions depopulated. War became a tool of control as much as conquest. These conflicts reshaped borders constantly. Maps drawn in Europe failed to reflect realities on the ground. Authority depended on presence, not claims. Forts marked power more clearly than treaties. Borders advanced and retreated with each conflict, leaving uncertainty as a permanent condition of colonial life. War also transformed colonial societies internally. Militarization increased, taxes rose, governments gained greater authority in the name of defense. Colonists grew accustomed to violence as a means of survival and expansion. This experience would later influence how colonial populations viewed power, authority, and resistance. By the end of the 17th century, the Americas were defined by instability. No empire held uncontested control. Every frontier was a potential battlefield. Every alliance was temporary. Colonial wars had redrawn the map repeatedly, but they had not resolved rivalry. Instead, they ensured that conflict would continue into the next century. The shifting borders of this era laid the groundwork for future wars on a much larger scale. The Americas had become inseparable from European power struggles. Violence was no longer an exception, it was the mechanism through which empire advanced, retreated, and reshaped the world. By the year 1700, the Americas had been irrevocably transformed. What had once been a world shaped almost entirely by indigenous civilizations had become a complex, contested landscape dominated by European empires. The changes were not limited to borders on a map. They were etched into the land, the peoples, and the systems that governed everyday life. Colonization had reshaped the Americas in ways that would define the modern world. European power was now firmly established. Spain still ruled vast territories across Central and South America, anchored by long-standing cities, religious institutions, and administrative systems. England's colonies along the Atlantic coast were expanding rapidly, filled with settlers who no longer viewed themselves as temporary residents, but as permanent inhabitants with growing political confidence. France controlled enormous inland territories through trade networks and alliances, while Dutch influence endured through commerce and finance even as territorial control declined. The demographic transformation was staggering. Indigenous populations had been reduced dramatically by disease, warfare, and displacement. Entire societies had collapsed, while others adapted and survived in altered forms. African populations in the Americas grew rapidly as slavery expanded, creating communities rooted in forced migration and resilience. European settlers multiplied, reshaping landscapes through agriculture, towns, and infrastructure. The Americas had become a place where peoples from 3 continents were bound together under unequal and often violent conditions. The land itself bore the marks of transformation. Forests were cleared for farms and plantations. Rivers were redirected to support trade and industry. Cities rose where indigenous centers once stood. New crops, animals, and technologies altered ecosystems permanently. The environment became an active participant in colonization, both exploited and reshaped to serve imperial needs. Economically, the Americas were fully integrated into the Atlantic world. Colonies supplied raw materials to Europe and consumed manufactured goods in return. Wealth flowed across oceans, enriching empires and financing wars. Slavery remained central to this system, embedding exploitation into global commerce. The pursuit of profit drove expansion, hardened social hierarchies, and justified continued violence. Culturally, the Americas became a mosaic of traditions and identities. European languages and religions spread widely, yet they did not erase indigenous and African cultures. Instead, new identities emerged through adaptation and survival. Music, food, belief systems, and social practices blended, forming cultures that were neither purely European nor indigenous nor African, but distinctly American. Politically, colonial societies matured. Systems of local governance developed, giving settlers experience with autonomy and self-rule. While still under imperial authority, colonies increasingly managed their own affairs. This shift planted the seeds of future challenges to empire. Loyalty remained, but expectations had changed. Violence remained ever present. Frontiers were unstable, borders contested, and conflict routine. Indigenous resistance continued. Slavery provoked fear of rebellion, and rival empires prepared for future wars. The peace of 1700 was fragile, sustained only by exhaustion rather than resolution. By this point, colonization was no longer an experiment. It was a system. Laws, economies, and social orders had hardened into structures that would endure for centuries. The choices made during this era about land, labor, race, and power set trajectories that shaped nations yet to be born. The Americas of 1700 were not a finished story, but a foundation. Empires stood strong, yet tensions simmered beneath the surface. Indigenous nations endured despite devastation. Enslaved people resisted in countless ways. Colonists grew increasingly aware of their own strength and interests. What Europe created in the Americas was a world of opportunity for some and suffering for many. It was a world built on ambition, conflict, and transformation. By 1700, the Old World and the New were permanently bound together, and the future of the Americas would be defined by the legacies of this colonial age.